Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your not-so-daily dose of the latest news, rumours and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Tuesday, July 23rd, and I'm your host Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. Now, I'm sure many of you will be delighted to see and hear that this is not going to be another marathon episode which goes on for hours and hours. Instead, we're going back to the roots of this podcast, and to start today's episode, we'll briefly cover some of the news from last week, focusing on the Rings of Power feature in the latest issue of Total Film magazine. Then, we'll return to a format I haven't done in a very long time, but I am so excited to bring back. We're going to be discussing questions sent in by you, the listeners. There were so many great questions, and I can't wait to talk about all these topics, from the different ways the shows could explore the effects of the 9 rings on their wearers, to our missing Númenórean characters like Anarion and Amandil. But for those of you who may be slightly disappointed that this is one of our shorter episodes, fear not, for San Diego Comic-Con is coming this Friday, and with it we expect we are now just days away from a Season 2 trailer. And you know what that means. This time next week, I'll be back with what will no doubt be an absolute monster of an episode, as Anna will be back to join me in breaking down every single frame of the new trailer. But first, whether it's a short episode or a long one, we must of course begin with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from the Silmarillion of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Isildur and Anarion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships up the great river Anduin, that flows out of Rhovanion into the western sea in the Bay of Belfalas, and they established a realm in those lands, that were after called Gondor, whereas the northern kingdom was named Arnor. Long before, in the days of their power, the mariners of Númenor had established a haven and strong places about the mouths of Anduin, in despite of Sauron in the black land that lay nigh upon the east. In the later days to this haven came only the faithful of Númenor, and many therefore of the folk of the coastlands in that region were in whole or in part akin to the elf friends and the people of Elendil, and they welcomed his sons. I hope you enjoyed that reading. Whilst it was brief, it was also nice to return to an extract that focused on Elendil and his sons. If you're wondering why I chose this reading for today's episode, well, you need only wait for the listener Q&A section of this episode, where you'll find a great deal of curiosity from listeners about the sons of Elendil, and in particular, the one who is mysteriously still yet to be seen. Now, as promised, we're starting today's episode with a very brief review of the latest Total Film magazine, which included 4 pages of set reports, quotes from the cast and crew, and some interesting insights into the production of Season 2. But the one disclaimer I'd like to add before we begin is that this feature does contain some descriptions of scenes and dialogue from Season 2. Like many of my fellow community members, I find this approach of directly spoiling individual scenes to be quite frustrating, and not actually something I'm looking for in the promotion campaign. Therefore, in today's segment, I will not be discussing any of the elements in this feature which I consider to be quite spoilerish for scenes in Season 2, especially those where we haven't already been shown them in the trailer or in the behind-the-scenes video. Now that might change after the Comic-Con trailer, but if so, we can return to that next week. With that all out the way, let's dive in to the Total Film feature. The article, like many others we've covered on the last 2 episodes, clearly originates in a set visit undertaken by Total Film's reporter during the filming of Season 2. In particular, the filming of this season's big battle. We get vivid descriptions of the on-site filming, from unnerving, realistic orc prosthetics being somewhat offset by an orcish extra drinking, quote, a green smoothie through a straw, to descriptions of muddy battle scenes strewn with fake bodies and impressively constructed war machines. As always, the most interesting insights from these articles come in the form of quotes from the show's cast and crew, which give us some tantalising previews of the journey our beloved characters will be undertaking next season. We will start, unsurprisingly, with my favourite character, Celebrimbor, and his actor Charles Edwards, who gives us the following insight into the Elven Smith's reaction to the arrival of Anatar. What makes Celebrimbor so interesting is how susceptible he is not only to flattery, but also to someone with power. Regardless of how wise you are, if a god walks into your living room and says, "I'm going to open up your worldview," you go with it. Outsiders may call it foolish, but Sauron cast a spell on him the moment he saw him. On the other side of this relationship, we get Charlie Vickers talking about his approach to playing Sauron's fair form opposite Celebrimbor. Everything about Anatar was for Celebrimbor. The way he looks and talks and the sense of stillness. Celebrimbor is world famous, at the peak of his craft, so to command his attention there had to be a sense of wisdom and weight and gravitas in the voice and the movement of the character. Now, combining these quotes from the two Charlies, we really are starting to get an idea of how the show is going to portray this Celebrimbor-Anatar dynamic, and listeners, let me tell you, I could not be more excited for it. Edward's description of Anatar as a god and saying that Sauron cast a spell on him is the absolutely perfect tone I was looking for in this relationship. As an audience, we should be seeing Celebrimbor being seduced and enthralled by Anatar every moment they're on screen, falling further and further into his clutches until he is completely lost. I'm also particularly pleased to hear that Charlie Vickers has taken a very deliberate approach to the physicality and the vocal quality of his performance as Anatar, making sure that a servant of the Valar feels distinct just from his presence on screen. However, I'd also highlight that Vickers says this about playing both the Halbrand and Anatar forms. The most important thing was finding a through line that connects the two characters, because they're both Sauron. I didn't want complete opposites. Now, this quote is also particularly reassuring to me, as it once again confirms that the show is not going down the Clark Kent Superman route, and that Celebrimbor's awareness of that connection from Halbrand to Anatar makes the deception that much sweeter. It's important that it's not just us, the audience, who are aware of this, but Celebrimbor himself, even if he doesn't realise that Halbrand, Anatar, well, they're all just different sides of the same Sauron. Before moving on from my favourite Elven Smith, I should add that the one new picture we received in Total Film was a gorgeous behind-the-scenes shot of Celebrimbor standing in his new forge, addressing his fellow Smiths. We'd already heard in Empire magazine that this new set was cathedral-like, and looking at this picture, that is a pitch-perfect description. From the stained glass windows to the towering pillars and gilded facades on the walls, this is truly a Region at the height of its majesty. I cannot wait to see more of this set on screen and spend hours looking at all the incredible detail the production team has put into it. Now, moving from Celebrimbor and Anatar to Elrond and Galadriel, we got some very interesting teasers of how the dynamic between these two legends of Middle-earth will continue to evolve. Robert Aramayo says of Elrond's relationship with Galadriel, "Conflict has been a part of their relationship, but it's more overt now, and operates in a different way. It makes it complicated as he cares about her. He loves her. It's really complex." Additionally, the showrunners described the complexity of Galadriel's character arc by saying, "You should be believing she could be an absolute hero and totally good, and at the same time, she has a serious Achilles heel of pride and weakness and vanity and lust for power." For me, both of these quotes reinforce an idea that Anna and I have discussed on previous episodes. The idea being that Galadriel's character arc is something that is appropriately going to take all 5 seasons to evolve, and that we're not going to see her become this perfect paragon of virtue from this season onwards. Meanwhile, the idea that Elrond is going to continue to struggle with his relationship with Galadriel, I think, will only build into this idea that after difficult moments with Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, and now Galadriel, Elrond's journey is going to move towards him becoming a leader in his own right, and through that, discovering what kind of leader he wants to be. I suspect Círdan may play a role in this. Speaking of which, we also get a couple more teasers of what we can expect to see with these two in the season, as Aramayo speaks excitedly about being involved in the introduction of Círdan's character, something selfishly he was very pleased about. whilst we also hear that both Elrond and Galadriel have scenes that echo their, quote, movie selves. I'll be particularly interested to see what elements of Elrond's Third Age story the showrunners are looking to foreshadow this season. Leaving the heart of Elvendom on Middle-earth and heading across to the deserts of Rhûn, we get a rather interesting quote from Daniel Wayman about how the stranger will be impacted by his meeting with old Tom Bombadil. For the stranger, when he comes across Tom, his brain is being expanded. There's an expansion of understanding and time and what that means for him. It was a lovely way for us to explore what it means to be a character who actually knows about the singing into being of the universe, the years of the trees. Now, admittedly, whilst I've been repeatedly on record about my concern over the Rhûn storyline and the inclusion of Bombadil, I do think that this is the most encouraging insight I've heard yet. For whoever the stranger actually is, I think his inclusion in the show does offer a special opportunity to explore the perspective of those beings whose existence predates even the elves, and how that affects their view of the world. And using Bombadil to bring out that side of the stranger is certainly something I can get behind. So, I will have some humility here and say this is a point in favour of the Singing Man of Whimsy. Now there's plenty more in the total film feature I could go over, but to be honest with you, most of it is either insights we've heard before, or descriptions of scenes and dialogue that I think really do cross over into spoiler territory. However, if you want all that extra spoilery goodness, I can highly recommend picking up a copy of Total Film magazine, where you'll get a description of the prologue's opening scene, descriptions of conversations between Adar and Sauron, a confirmed line from Bombadil, and even a rather puzzling description of a scene featuring Durin and Disa. Regardless, we'll leave it there for now, and we shall swiftly move on to my anticipated section of the show, which is, of course, getting to answer your questions. Now, much like my conversations with Anna, this next section will be unscripted, so please do sit back and enjoy my unfiltered and unrefined thoughts on your most pressing questions. So let's get into these questions. We'll start with a couple of questions on a storyline that hasn't featured much in this season's promotion, that of course being Númenor. We'll start with a question from Robert Joseph at Robert Joe Scribe, who asks, can you talk about Anarion and set my mind at ease? Because honestly, if he's not in Season 2 at all, that's still mystifying to me. You'd think the absence of Isildur and the direction of the Númenor plot would make it a perfect season to introduce him. Now, this was also a question posed to us by Emma Victory at Fem2Brewster, who also asked, do you think we will see or hear anything of Anarion this season? Now, I wanted to combine those two questions. Obviously, they're both asking about Anarion, but also because I think that Emma may have hit on the truth here when Emma asks, do you think we will see or hear anything of Anarion? And I think, as I've said before, I've been privy to some behind-the-scenes information about Númenor, some of which I've released, some of which I haven't. I've also been very upfront that I haven't heard anything about Anarion. Now, full transparency, that may be because my sources just weren't aware of him, wouldn't have recognised him, weren't present when those scenes were filmed, or weren't privy to any of the scripts or anything like that. So it's totally possible that they are hiding Anarion as a surprise, that he will appear, but maybe it's going to be towards the back end of the season and it's going to be in quite a secret capacity. So maybe that's why we haven't heard about it, maybe that's why the showrunners haven't mentioned it, all totally possible. But let's talk about Robert's question, which I think is the more interesting part of this, which is, if he's not in Season 2, why isn't he in Season 2? And this idea of it being quite a mystifying idea given where the Númenorian plot is going. So obviously, Númenor this season, they're getting into the rise of Pharazôn, they're getting more deeply into the divide between Kingsmen and the Faithful, and I can see what Robert's saying here, that essentially, if you're getting into the divide between the Kingsmen and the Faithful, why wouldn't you at this point bring Anarion in, who we have already heard is out on the west of Númenor, which in the show's terms at least is associated with the Faithful, and there's obviously canon basis for that in text with the Lords of Andúnier. But why wouldn't they bring him in? And to use a very bad analogy, I'm going to borrow from the classic film Shrek, and that is to say that plots are a bit like onions. They have layers. And I think what they're doing with the Numenor plot is they're slowly peeling back the layers each season. And through doing that, we're getting more depth each time. So let me try and explain what I mean. In Season 1, we get a brief introduction to Numenor. We get almost a scene setter of, especially for the audience who haven't read the books, what Numenor is, what it's about, what some of the tensions maybe are, obviously around Miriel's father, the separation from the elves. We're introduced to Pharazôn, we're introduced to Elendil, who are obviously kind of two signifiers in this political divide to come. And then we kind of leave it as it is at the end of Season 1 with the death of the king, setting us up for where we know the canon storyline goes, which is the rise of Pharazôn and the divide between the king's men and the faithful. So where are they going to go with that in Season 2? Here's what I think. I think in Season 2, due to the prevalence of the Sauron storylines this season, which the showrunners have been very upfront about this season, Sauron is the spine of the season. That means that Numenor, by definition, is going to be on the periphery. Now, that's not me saying that I don't think it'll get sufficient screen time. I think it won't have the most screen time, but I think it'll still get as much, if not more, than last year, simply because it will be present from episode 1 rather than last season where it started at episode 3. But because it is separate to Sauron, the storyline they're going to have to tell there needs to be very tight. And I think how they're going to do that is focus it on a really small group of characters. I think it is going to be almost totally about Miriel, Pharazôn, and Elendil. Now, there are going to be supporting characters. We're going to see how Anarion continues to evolve her relationship with Kemen and perhaps get closer to Pharazôn's side of the divide. We're probably going to see more... We're going to see a few members of the Númenórean nobility and how they play into this. We've got another question about this later, so I'll hold on to that for now. So we're going to set the scene for the divide at the top of Númenórean society, at the royal level, the divide between the past king, between Miriel as the assumed ascendant queen, and Pharazôn and his ambitions for power. Now, because they're doing that, I think, again, it's going to be very tight. We're going to stay a lot within the royal court of Númenor until certain things happen, and then we're going to start to see the impacts of Pharazôn's rise to power. But importantly, what I don't think we're going to see is the impact of that on the whole of the kingdom of Númenor. And that's essentially, and it might not seem like I've answered the question, but hopefully I can tie this all back together. Essentially, that's why I think Anarion may not feature this season, or if he doesn't, he will not feature prominently. Because what we know about Anarion is that he's out on the west coast of Númenor. We think he's connecting with pockets of the faithful out there on the western shore. If Season 2 is going to focus on the capital, on Armenelos, and in particular the royal dynamics there, we're not going to see the larger impact on Númenor as a nation until Season 3. And consider this, we don't know where Elendil's storyline ends in Season 2, but we've seen that he's going to end up in prison at one point. We suspect he's going to be in a very perilous position with his loyalty to Miriel and the faithful, and we suspect that there might be a situation which causes him to be shunned further from society. Listen, if you end up in prison, without any spoilers, if you end up in prison, your standing in society doesn't go that well. So, this isn't anything based on my information, but I would just say, I think there is a high possibility that Season 2 ends with Elendil leaving Armenelos, either by choice or out of necessity, and that will lead into Season 3, where we will still be in Armenelos. We'll still be seeing Pharazôn and Miriel and Anarion and Kemen and some of the new characters we've been introduced to, but Elendil will go and open up a whole new part of Númenor for us, and he will be going at the end of Season 2 to go and find Anarion. And I think that's why they're saving Anarion, in essence. I think what they're doing is trying to peel back the layers on Númenor. So Season 1 was just the surface. Season 2, we're going to get into some of the meat of it, but still stay with a close focus, almost a close lens. And then Season 3 will go out widescreen to see how Númenor is changing as a nation, and which will also allow Isildur's return to Númenor to play into that. And that's essentially why I think they might not have decided to bring Anarion in. Now, I completely understand some people are disappointed about this. I personally would have liked to have seen him introduced this season, if not last season. But from what I'm gathering, from all the interviews, from the quotes, from what we know, I think this is about a very layered approach to Númenor, and in a season where Númenor has to be very strict with its screen time because of all the focus on Sauron, he may just have to wait until Season 3. So that's what I think. To bring up Emma's point, I do think we'll hear more about him. Again, I think that's what's going to drive Elendil in the last third of this season. So thank you to Robert and Emma for those questions. Staying with Númenor and also with characters we haven't seen, Velvet Rapture asks, since they are going further into the faithful versus Kingsmen politics in Númenor, do you think we may see Amandil even briefly? So for those of you who haven't read the books, I'll just give a bit of context here. Amandil is Elendil's father. Now, what we know of Amandil in the books, just to give a very SparkNotes version of it, is that when he was young, he was friends with Pharazôn. He was, in fact, a counselor to the king until certain things happen in Númenor, which obviously I won't spoil for non-book readers. But Amandil was a very prominent figure within the Númenorian court. He was the last lord of Andúnié, which is, I forgot to mention this in my last response, so apologies, but is one of the major cities in Númenor. And he then plays a very significant role towards the end of the Akalabeth story in terms of how the Númenorian faithful respond to the fate of Númenor and trying to avert a disaster that they think is coming. So do I think the show will include him? First of all, I really hope they do. In fact, when I saw that Ciarán Hinds had been cast in Rings of Power, I'd really hoped that he was playing Amandil, but sadly that doesn't appear to be the case, as has been revealed since. Do I think we'll see him? There's 2 points. One, obviously they would need to get the rights from the Tolkien estate, because I'm fairly certain he doesn't appear in the appendices, which is what they have the rights to. Now, clearly they work with the Tolkien estate on a case-by-case basis to get additional rights. We know they've done that with the Anatar name in Season 1. They did it by getting the name Armenelos as well as the map of Númenor. They're clearly able to work with the Tolkien estate on a case-by-case basis. So I wouldn't be shocked if the showrunners were able to get the rights to Amandil. Do I think they will? I hope so. But to kind of go back to our last question, if you've delayed introducing Anarion for this long, I wonder whether they're going to go into Season 3 and introduce not only Anarion, but also Amandil. Might be a bit much. On the other hand, if I'm right about them wanting to kind of peel back the layers on Númenor and really give us an idea in Season 3 of what a faithful community will look like, then I would include Amandil, because I think he would be a great way of doing that. And giving Elendil his father figure, well, not just a father figure, but his literal father, I think would be a great way to show different sides to his character. In the same way we've talked about Círdan being that for Gil-galad, I think having Amandil on screen could be really helpful. As for my guess, I would say it's 50-50 whether we see him, but given his, what can I say? His very iconic moment in the Akalabeth towards the end of that story, I think the showrunners would be foolish not to include him. But again, maybe a rights issue, maybe a scope issue, so we'll have to wait and see. Now, moving on from our unseen Númenorian boys to the ones we know and love, Myron at Transmyron asks, do you think Isildur will reunite with his family / go back to Númenor this season, or if Elendil will find out he's still alive, or do you think that they're saving that for Season 3? Personally, I hope it's a Season 3 thing, so we get to see Isildur truly bond with Middle-earth. Now, this is a really good question, and something I've pondered. I think I've long been of the opinion that they will keep Isildur in Númenor for the majority, in Middle-earth for the majority of Season 2, and that's simply because I think it's really important that Isildur is able to grow as his own character. In fact, in that Total Film magazine, Maxime Baldry, who plays Isildur, even refers to this season as being about Isildur going from boyhood to manhood. So I think we can kind of see where Season 2 is going for him. But more importantly, I think it's about him building a connection with the lands he'll one day rule as one of the kingdoms in exile post the Akalabeth. So I do think he'll be in Middle-earth for most of, if not all of Season 2. But if you would like my sort of crack theory, I've been wondering whether he gets back to Númenor in Season 2 or whether he just leaves Middle-earth at the end of Season 2. I have been wondering whether Círdan will play a role in it. Now, I don't really have any evidence for this. Except for the fact, I wonder what Isildur is going to be doing in the last few episodes of the season when we know we're going to be getting the Battle of Eregion. That will be the focus. And I'm trying to think why Isildur would stay in Pelargir. Now, could he stay there because of Estrid, this new character he's going to meet? Could he stay there because he thinks that he can do more good there than he can in Númenor, and to prove to his father that he's worthy of, all those ideals they talked about in Season 1, Episode 5? Maybe, but I do kind of think he would want to go and return to his people. And that's where I think that how would he get back? Well, he's not going to just build a ship himself, but could there be a way he could get back with Círdan's help? Now, I haven't quite worked out in my mind how that fits together, but the reason I think they might do that is because obviously one of Círdan's main traits from the books is that he's one of the main elves to have formed positive alliances and relationships with Númenorians in the past, before Númenor pulled away from the elves. So I think this could be a good way to draw that part of it into it, and it would allow him, and therefore Elendil, to have a connection with Círdan and Gil-galad before they even return to Middle-earth post-Calabeth. So that's my theory. I'm not confident in it, as you can tell, but I agree with you. I do think he'll be there for most of Season 2 to bond with Middle-earth. Do I think Elendil will find out he's still alive? Probably not. I think the only way that happens is obviously if Isildur returns by Episode 8, or if, as there's a change of power and rule in Númenor, Númenor starts pursuing an aggressive colonialist expansion plan, and we see Númenorian ships and settlers arrive in Pelargir, and that could be a way that either Isildur himself or word of Isildur makes its way back to Númenor. But those are my two theories, I think. Now, keeping on our theme of the race of men, let's just shift sideways to the 9 of them that will be receiving some new fashion accessories. This question comes from my good friend, the Blue Wizard on Wheels, at wizard_wheels, who asks, what are your thoughts on how the show will portray the fading of the receivers of the 9 rings of men? I'm very interested to see how this would be shown due to the time compression. Now, this is a question, when I saw it from Wizard on Wheels, I thought this is a good question, because it's not something I've thought about a lot, but it poses a really interesting problem for the showrunners, which I think is, with time compression, anytime you have to deal with fading, with gradual change, it's quite hard to do. And I think the way they'll get around it is that we're not going to see the 9 become wraiths, by the end of Season 5. I think what we'll see, and this will probably be achieved through a mix of makeup. I don't think they'll need too much prosthetics for this, maybe some VFX enhancement, but I think we're going to see from when these 9 men receive these rings, which I think I'll get onto this in a bit, but I think will largely be in the 3rd season of the Rings of Power. From then until the end of Season 5, I think what we'll see is them go through an almost change, where we'll see these 9 men have their fortunes go up. They receive these rings, and it allows them to gain power, to gain influence, to gain whatever it is they desire, which we know is how they become kings, sorcerers, great warriors, etc. But then there will be a turning point where the toll of the ring each of them wears starts to, wear on them, and we'll start to see them become more gaunt, more haggard, to the point where when we get to the end of Season 5, Battle of the Last Line, so I'm sure the 9 will be there, I wonder whether they will look physically as if they are moving towards the idea of wraiths that we have for the Nazgûl. So that's my theory, that it won't be shown totally, but it will be shown as part of their character arcs and part of showing the devil's bargain they make by receiving rings from Sauron. Now, I think there's good arguments there about how effective you're going to be able to show that in 3 seasons of a TV show. Again, I've always thought there might be a time jump between Seasons 4 and 5, so that could be another way they handle it. But to answer your question directly, I do think they will show fading, but maybe not in a literal sense, more in a sense of a wasting away of their physical nature and almost the light behind their eyes. I think we might see them become hollow shells of themselves, and become more and more just enslaved to Sauron's will and almost have less personality. So again, some of that might be done by costume, by makeup, by VFX, but I think a lot of it will be done by whichever actors are playing these 9, by their performances themselves. Now, we've talked about the Nine more broadly, but we also got a question focusing in on the Nazgûl in chief, the Witch King, with Olaf Hisborg at Hisborg asking, how likely do you think it is that Will Keen will portray the future Witch King? Think about it. A keen Pharazôn supporter that will become the Witch King? Also, WK, as in Will Keen, equals WK, as in Witch King. I mean, first of all, just a fantastic question, Olaf, and you know I always have appreciation for a good pun here and there, and this one containing multiple puns was most appreciated. I'll also pair this question with another one that relates to this topic, which came from Alan Smith at Kidus Milkias, who asks, do you think we will get major storylines and screen time for characters like the Witch King and Oathbreakers? I like what the show did with the character Adar, and I hope these characters get the same treatment. So I'll tackle these together because obviously it's all rotating around the Witch King, how the show's going to portray him, who's going to portray him. As for Will Keen, so for those of you who don't know, Will Keen is one of the new cast members of Season 2, and he's one of the few we have seen in footage from Season 2, I think only in the behind-the-scenes video, but we get a couple of shots of him standing next to Pharazôn, very stern look on his face, looks like he's giving the kind of evil stinky eye to Miriel and Elendil, and I think I've talked about this in the past, and I feel fine talking about it now, but I did get some information about Will Keen's character, that he is going to play an ally to Pharazôn now. What his exact role will be, whether he is going to be eyeing for Pharazôn's job if Pharazôn's got an eye on the throne, who knows, we'll have to see, but I do think he's going to be playing an ally to Pharazôn. As for whether he could be the Witch King, beyond the obvious great puns of WK and keen Pharazôn supporter, I think there's a chance. My theory has always been that while we know at least three of the nine, at least three of the Nazgûl were Númenóreans, I don't think we're ever told whether or not the Witch King is or isn't. Obviously, he gets the name Angmar when he founds his kingdom there in the north of Middle-earth. So it's not necessarily that he came from there, it's just where he established a kingdom. So the showrunners have quite a lot of freedom. Do I think Will Keen will play the Witch King? I would say maybe a 25% chance. Not because I don't think Will Keen's a brilliant actor. I think he's fantastic. I just wonder whether the Witch King is going to be a character in Middle-earth rather than Númenor. Now, do I think Will Keen will become a Ringwraith? Yes, I think there's a very high possibility. If he is an ally of Pharazôn, if he does represent one of those power bases of the King's Men in Númenor, then yes, I think he is one of the three that Pharazôn could target. And then for the other question from Alan Smith, who asked about, will we get major storylines and screen time for characters like the Witch King and Oathbreakers? I think we have to. I think we have to for at least a couple of the Ringwraiths. I think the Witch King is obviously one. Cumul the Easterling is another, because those are the only two named or, titled Ringwraiths we get. I do think we have to get storylines for those two. I don't think we're going to get major storylines for all 7 of them. That's just a practicality issue. You can't tell 9 separate major storylines for each of these characters. But what you probably will have is, like I said, seeing as we know 3 of them are Númenóreans, could they be a mix of a character like Will Keen, a noble at court, a Númenórean who is sent by Pharazôn to expand and settle Númenor's presence in Middle-earth, so, a kind of Lord of Umbar or Pelagia, someone who tries to, impose their will on Middle-earth. That could be another Ringwraith, and obviously there are candidates like Kemen, Pharazôn's son, or even if you want to go really dark, Anarion, Elendil's daughter. So I think we will get quite a few storylines, but I'm not going to say they're going to be major. As for the Oathbreakers, yes, I 100% think the Oathbreakers, the future Men of the Mountain, who then become, the undead who Aragorn will one day hold to their oaths. I do think we're going to have to see that. Now, we might not see them until Season 4-5, unless, and those of you who are long-time listeners to the podcast know my feeling on this, unless they go with my theory, which is that Theo makes a perfect King of the Oathbreakers, King of the Dead, because he has that connection to the land, because he has that similarity with Isildur, that they're both going to be a character who've lost their homes, and because he is going to interact with Isildur this season. I think, listen, I know it's still a bit of an out there theory, but I really like the idea of Theo becoming the King of the Oathbreakers. we'll probably have a better idea of that once we see Season 2. I think if they are going down that route, we'll see some major hints. Of course, there are some people who still think Theo's going to be one of the Ringwraiths. I think that's a possibility. I hope not, just because I don't want him to have that sad a story. Not that the Oathbreakers don't have a sad story, but, at least he won't be enslaved to Sauron for all time. So, we'll have to see. But yes, to answer your question, I do think we'll get quite a lot of exposition on those characters, but we're not going to get 9 major storylines for each of the Ringwraiths. Now, with the men out the way, let's get back to something I'm always happy to talk about, which is, of course, Annatar, Celebrimbor, and the elves. I'm going to start with a question from my good friend Susie, at Coruscant, spelt with a V, who asks 2 questions relating to this story. Hope's thoughts for the Annatar reveals himself to Celebrimbor as Sauron scene, and Elrond finding out Galadriel messed up royally and brought back Sauron scene. I've seen some things on Twitter that have me a bit concerned for both these scenes, and I'll tie the second part of Susie's question in with another similar question I got from @Dankferric, who asked, do you think we will see any major shifts in Elrond and Galadriel's friendship? So let me address that part, the second part of Susie's question and Dankferric's question, Elrond and Galadriel's friendship, and what that scene might be where Elrond kind of finds out the truth about Halbrand and what Galadriel did. I do think it is going to be a major point of conflict, and I think Elrond will feel that Galadriel betrayed his trust, and he will feel that she has maybe proved true what Gil-galad thought about her, and I think it will shake his faith in her a little bit, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think, in any character arc, or in this case, the relationship between 2 characters, I think you need these ups and downs. It can't just be Elrond kind of hero-worshipping Galadriel for 5 seasons, and then meeting her daughter and going, well, I'd like to marry you, yes please. I think it has to be about these ups and downs. And I think having Elrond go through almost a crisis of faith in Galadriel is really important. And as I talked about in the Total Film section, I think it's really important as well that Elrond continues this journey of being his own, I was going to say man, but I guess half man, half elf, in being his own leader. I think he has to move away from looking to Gil-galad or Celebrimbor or Galadriel. As we've already found out, we're going to see Círdan be a bit of a mentor, and as I discussed on the last episode, I think Círdan is going to be a really strong influence in shaping Elrond towards being a leader who sees his primary duty as being a haven and being able to protect others. And I think that's where Elrond's character journey is going. And I think Galadriel has to go on her own journey. And, you can really compare and contrast someone like Galadriel and someone like Círdan. Galadriel has a lot of pride. She has a lust to, she has a great desire to rule a kingdom of her own. She is drawn to power, and she is drawn to these temptations. Círdan is the complete opposite. He doesn't seek power. He doesn't even really seek to be a ruler. He just does it out of almost necessity to protect others. And even when he's given a ring of power, he only holds on to it as long as he has to before giving it to Gandalf. So I think this idea of these 2 different approaches to Elrond is really important. And again, I think Galadriel has to go on her own journey. And part of that is making mistakes. And that's okay. And the thing I really want to say is people always say, oh, it's so bad that, they had Galadriel involved with Sauron's return and, this undermines blah, 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 blah. And I just think, for me, it's totally fine that Galadriel makes these mistakes. It's absolutely fine that she has these stumbles, these pitfalls, and that she is fallible. There is nothing interesting to me about a character who doesn't make these mistakes, and I think given what we've heard from the showrunners, she is going to be refocused on protecting Middle-earth, but that doesn't mean she is going to be without any of her flaws, and I'm excited to see how that happens. As for your first question, Susie, on a potential scene where, Annatar will reveal himself to Celebrimbor as Sauron, we assume obviously this will happen towards the end of the season, during or after the Siege of Eregion. Annatar is going to have to reveal that he really was Sauron all along. What are my hopes for that scene? I think it should be heartbreaking for Celebrimbor that he realizes he's been used and how far he's fallen. But what I would really want to see, and this is so important to me, I want Celebrimbor to be angry. I want him to be furious. I want him in that moment to be the one who wants to strike Sauron down. He wants to, if he could, murder him with his own two hands. I think Celebrimbor is going to be shamed by the experience, but I don't want him to meekly, cower in fear as he realizes it's Sauron. I want him to have that Feanorian pride and to fight back and to have that last moment of defiance that we talk about from the books. So that I don't have too many more thoughts on that because it's still very difficult to tell how exactly they're going to play all that part out. But yeah, I really want Celebrimbor to have that rage and defiance and anger and that desire to undo the harm he's done by ending Sauron. And obviously we know he won't be successful, but still, I'd like to see that. Now, another question on our favourite Elven Smith and Trixie Maiar is brought to us by Transmyron once again, who asks, do you think Celebrimbor or Annatar will be the one to give Durin one of the Dwarven rings? Because the lore is actually contradictory on this. We'll likely see both Celebrimbor and Annatar in Khazad-dûm this season, so I have absolutely no idea which one they'll choose. I mean, to be honest with you, Myron, I have no damn idea at all either. Obviously, in the books, you have two versions. You have the one where Celebrimbor gives Durin one of the rings pre-Sauron's revelation of who he is and pre the sack of Eregion, but you equally have the version where Sauron only gathers all 7 of the Dwarven rings and all 9 of the rings for men post the sack of Eregion, and it's only then when he starts distributing them. So, which one will actually be the one to give Durin one of the rings? I think it will be Celebrimbor. Or do I think that? Okay, I think there's 2 ways they go about it. I think if Celebrimbor is the one to do it, he does it to re-establish the alliance and relationship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, repair the issues with Elrond and Gil-galad and the Mithril from last season. But Annatar will be standing right behind him and making sure he is very visible to the dwarves. Or, and this is my only other idea, I have wondered whether there will be parts of this season where Annatar leaves Eregion and he just tells Celebrimbor he has important work to do elsewhere, Maiar business, don't ask too much. And I wonder whether there will be a moment where Annatar goes to Khazad-dûm on his own and personally starts to weave his dark roots into the rocks of Khazad-dûm and try to influence Durin and the rest of the dwarves, and he will be the one to give the rings. I don't think that's as likely, partly because in the shot we see from the trailer where Durin's picking up his ring, if you freeze it at the right moment, you can see there are at least 2 other rings beside it. So that makes me think that we may actually see the distribution of most, if not all, of the 7 pre the Battle of Eregion, in which case I do think Celebrimbor has to be involved, but again, I think Annatar will be with him all along. But like I said, they could go either way, that's just my best guess. We also got another question from Velvet Rapture, who focuses in on the details of the new rings and asks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the ringcraft will be explored in the show. Tolkien didn't really talk in his writings and notes, so there is some room for interpretation. How does Annatar help Celebrimbor to tap into the unseen world? How do the rings work? Yeah, I think this is a really hard one because you can see how the showrunners were struggling with it last season when they went with the idea of an alloy to be the piece of advice that Halbrand gives Celebrimbor. And some people have been very kind of snooty about it, going, oh, Celebrimbor didn't know about alloys. Yes, obviously he did. He just didn't think it would work with Mithril, and clearly Halbrand, as Sauron, was influencing him to use the Mithril and probably how to use the Mithril. We just didn't see it on screen because we don't see everything on screen. I still acknowledge that people may have found that a weak part of the plot, so fine. So how do they do it in Season 2 when they're making more rings? It's a really good question. I don't think we're going to see them chanting spells or, magic dust or, anything that you might see in some fantasy shows. I do wonder whether we will hear some incantations, if not, spells, just some words spoken in Quenya over the making of the rings, whether there's an element of Sauron's idea of pouring some of your essence into the ring. So I don't think they're going to have Celebrimbor, mix his blood with the rings, obviously, but is there a way to show that some of Celebrimbor's spirit is being tapped into it? Perhaps we'll see Celebrimbor, kind of like how we discussed with the Nazgûl earlier, maybe we'll see Celebrimbor become more physically haggard or drained by making these rings. As for the question of how do the rings work, listen, I'm a big believer you just don't explain that. You shouldn't. It's just, I know there are some fantasy stories which have hard magic systems where everything has rules and is explained. For me, Tolkien isn't that and shouldn't be that. I don't want to know how exactly the rings work. I don't want to know exactly what makes the forging of the rings feel magical, which leads me to say that the real challenge and the real way you get around this is cinematography, is music, is maybe a little bit of VFX, but it's really in the way you shoot it. You don't explain it, you show it through the visual language. And I think that's the only way you can do it without it coming across as kind of like, add 1 part magic dust and 2 parts mithril to get your magic rings. That just doesn't really work for me. So yeah, I admit, Velvet Rapture, I don't have a good answer for you on this, but that's the best I can do. Staying with the influence of Sauron on the elves, Xenos at XenosAtron asks, so many questions right now, but this one keeps coming up on my timeline, and I'm interested in your thoughts. How do you think they resolve Galadriel knowing Halbrand is Sauron's situation without making her even more culpable for what happens to Celebrimbor later on? Does she tell everyone immediately about her involvement with Sauron, or does she withhold the information? These are just 2 examples. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but I'm worried about her getting blamed even more. Yeah, this kind of follows on from Susie's question earlier about her relationship with Elrond. Listen, I think part of this is the rings have become a necessity. They were made for a purpose, to stop the fading, to stop the blight in Lindon, to just, in general, save the elves. So the rings are necessary, and the show has made that clear. So Galadriel isn't going to be at fault for that. As for the idea, is she culpable for Sauron's rise, and is she therefore culpable for what happens to Eregion, for what happens with Celebrimbor? I don't know, I feel like I disagree with a lot of people on here, but I feel like blaming the person who was manipulated, gaslit, completely kind of exploited is... I understand why people say that, because Halbrand comes across as such a sympathetic character for a lot of Season 1. But once we now know he is Sauron, it feels weird to me that people continue with this narrative that Galadriel is the enabler, not the victim of Sauron's manipulations. And that's just, again, maybe I just see it different to other people and everyone's allowed their own interpretation. But to me, I always find this a difficult one, because for me, Galadriel is a victim of the Great Deceiver. Listen, we know Sauron, that is what he is known for. He is a deceiver above all else. So, is she responsible for what happens to Celebrimbor? No more than Celebrimbor is responsible for the fact he happens to ignore all the other elves shunning Anatar and embracing this Maiar who's encouraging him to make more rings, It is the character's flaws which Sauron exploits, and Galadriel's flaws in Season 1 were that she had a thirst for vengeance. She was driven by her PTSD, by her grief, by her loss. She was driven by all of these things, and Sauron placed himself in her path and said, oh, look, here is a lost king of men who can help you achieve your goals, who can help you redeem yourself and do good in Middle-earth. And she is left ruined by it, in a sense. So that's what I think about the blame part. As for the does she tell everyone immediately about her involvement? Yeah, I think she does. I think because Elrond has the scroll with the lineage of the kings of the Southlands, I think Elrond has worked it out pretty much by that last scene at the end of episode 8 that Halbrand isn't who he said he was, and Galadriel's not going to have a choice, because if anything she's going to say we need the rings even more now to protect against Sauron, even if she knows that accepting the ring may be a temptation and a path to darkness in itself for her. So I do think she tells everyone immediately, with the exception perhaps of Celebrimbor. And I wonder if that's because the first thing we'll see is Elrond and Galadriel riding hard for Lindon to get the rings there, because obviously, remember, there was this idea that they were running out of time. And so Elrond isn't going to bring it up in front of Celebrimbor, which means that while Elrond and Galadriel are in Lindon and they're discussing it with Gil-galad, and Gil-galad's saying, set a watch on every crossing, we must find Halbrand, we must stop him. Halbrand's going to reappear in Eregion, either as himself or as Anatar, and so Celebrimbor's not going to get the first word from Galadriel, he's going to get the first word from Sauron, and we know how good Sauron is at manipulating. So I think that's going to be why Celebrimbor is maybe out of the loop at first, and then by the time Galadriel comes back to Eregion and says, what are you, he says, I've had a visitor, and Galadriel says, what the hell are you doing? I told you not to treat with Halbrand if he should ever return. Celebrimbor's already under Sauron's spell. As Charles Edwards said, Sauron casts a spell on him effectively. He thinks he's a god. So those are my thoughts on it. Again, other people are going to have different interpretations, but I don't agree with this narrative that Galadriel is the perpetrator rather than the victim. It just feels to me like a backwards reading of the situation. Yeah, so that's my view. And staying with the elves for one last question, but moving from pesky Sauron to the goodest of good boys, we get to talk about Círdan for a second week in a row, as my friend Anne at Valandil asks, what are your predictions on how Círdan will receive the news of the forging of the Three Rings, and what do you think his overarching role will be in Season 2? If you've already talked about this, then I would love to hear your ideas and hopes for Círdan's relationships with the other characters on the show, Gil-galad, Elrond, Celebrimbor, Galadriel, etc. So we've talked mostly about that second part, about ideas and hopes for Círdan's relationships on the last episode, but I do think Anne raised an interesting question about how does Círdan react to the forging of the Three Rings? And the only way I can describe what I hope his reaction is just, a massive sigh, a kind of his temples start hurting. He just gets that sense that what is the last Feanorian in Middle-earth doing now? Círdan has been witness to every folly of the elves throughout the First Age. And I think he is going to see this as another folly. But I think he will accept the ring from Gil-galad because, again, he is all about duty, he is all about service, and like the rest of the elves, he wants to forestall the fading of the elves because he has been given his mission by the Valar, and he will hold true to that. But I think he's going to be really mad about it. And I think he's going to just see the history of the elves repeating themselves. And I wonder whether, much how Celebrimbor told the story about the Silmarils in Season 1, I wonder whether we'll see Círdan kind of once again draw back on his knowledge and his experience of the First Age to say to Elrond, to Galadriel, this is folly, this is us reaching beyond our grasp, this is us meddling with powers that we should not be meddling with. And I think he needs to be the one elf who really sees this as an issue, because remember, as we discussed on last week's episode, Círdan has greater foresight than any other elf, than Elrond, than Galadriel, than Gil-galad. He has the greatest foresight, so he's going to know that even if they need these rings to forestall the fading of the elves, it is going to lead to bad things, very bad things. And so I think Círdan will accept his ring begrudgingly, but I think it will be because he also knows that they are on the path to ruin. So that's what I think about Círdan and the rings. Now, with those questions done, we're finished with the elves, but we did also get a question about Sauron's return to Mordor, as Agroponics Limited asks, how will Sauron make the orcs obey and respect him again throughout the season after Adar's betrayal? Now, this is the question that I think if you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I would have said, he's going to impose his will using his Maiarly powers on Adar, he's going to, through a show of force, he's going to forge the One Ring, all these things that we think of traditionally. But I think everything we've heard from the showrunners, from the cast, all these interviews and articles, is that it's far more likely that he's going to let Adar think that he is still in control for most of Season 2, and he's going to manipulate him into attacking Eregion. And I think it is only going to be after Eregion has been attacked and he has recovered the rings and everything that happens there. It's only then that he'll assume control of the orcs. Now, is he going to kill Adar to make that happen? I hope not, because as I've said before, I really want Adar to continue into future seasons. But if he does kill Adar, that is one way to, make the orcs obey and respect him. And I think we may also see some glimpses of this in the prologue, which I won't get into because of spoilers, but I think we're almost probably going to have a parallel to the start of the season and the end of the season, with Sauron starting the season being betrayed by Adar and losing his power, and by the end of the season he'll be the one in control of Adar and the rest of the orcs. Now, like I said, whether that involves killing Adar to establish that totalitarian control of the orcs, I don't know, but he will certainly be in full control by the end of the season. But to go back to your question, I don't think it's going to be throughout the season. I think specifically Sauron is going to be more about manipulation and deception rather than just trying to take control immediately. Now, heading north from the Land of Shadow, we get to our last questions about any specific storylines, with one from ABG at Bukhara Bajit, who asks, will we get Gandalf the Blue, or will the stranger's identity remain unsolved for the season? Now, you know how I feel about this this storyline. I think it's Gandalf. I think it's definitely Gandalf. I think the showrunners are not going to treat the audience with that little respect, to put all these signs and to lay out the path. As they've said themselves, when we get to the end of Season 5, it should all look inevitable for where all the characters end up and how they got there. But you can have mysteries along the way. So I think it has to be Gandalf. Obviously, we've heard there is going to be another wizard in Season 2, played by Círdan Hines. We don't know who that's going to be. So I guess I'll say this. I would be perfectly fine if the stranger is Gandalf and goes and finds the two blue wizards in Rhûn. In fact, I would love that, because I think I'd love to see the blue wizards. I just don't think, based on what they've done in Season 1, Gandalf should be one of them. But obviously, hearing that there is going to be another wizard in Rhûn, that does make me think that maybe the stranger could be a blue wizard. I don't think he is, and I really hope the show doesn't go that route. Not because I don't want to see the blue wizards, but because I think it's really important that you don't treat the audience like idiots just for the sake of a surprise twist. With that all said, to answer your question, will we get a confirmation this season? I have the worst feeling we won't. I really think they should, but I just have this utter pit of dread in my mind that they're somehow going to get through Season 2 without just having him say his own name. And that's going to be exhausting. So I hope they don't do that, but that is my worry. And now I'll tie that last question up with a rather cheeky one from Gordon at That's Not My Cow, who asks, what do you think of the report that 25% of Tom Bombadil's dialogue in Season 2 is coming from the books? So I didn't cover this in the first section because I wanted to leave it for this question. Yes, in the Total Film magazine, we hear that 25% of all his dialogue in Season 2, in the episode season, however many that is, comes directly from the books. What do I think about that? Honestly, if you want my real honest opinion and not just be annoying about my hatred for Tom Bombadil, I think it's great. I think it's great because I think probably trying to do too much mimicry of the very particular way Tolkien wrote Bombadil could end up absolutely awful. So I imagine that the 25% of Bombadil's dialogue that they're taking is a lot of the whimsical stuff, the songs, the kind of hey doll, merry doll, because that's the bit you really want to take word for word. And we know, I won't reveal the spoiler, but there's at least one specific line which they have confirmed, which I think is very clever to use, even if it's not one of the whimsy part. I think it's very clever to add gravitas to Bombadil. I think that other 75% will be a challenge for them to make sure he has the right tone. But here's what I'll say. As much as I don't like Tom Bombadil, I actually do think if you're going to include him in the show, you have to commit 100%. He needs to sing, he needs to be whimsical, he needs to be slightly strange and unnerving, and you can't do that if you don't borrow from the book's dialogue. So actually, in a rare tip of my hat, in a rare clip of my own boots to Tom, I will say I think this is a very smart move from the showrunners, and I am interested to see. Listen, I've always said I'm curious to see what they'll do with him. Still not an idea I love. Would rather he wasn't in the show, but I do agree. I think this is an encouraging sign. And finally, our last question, or I should say last two questions. We got a much broader one from King Arthur at Crash22Crash, who asked, what is your current estimate for how all 5 seasons are going to play out, especially considering the following canon storylines? Forging of the Seven, 9 and 1, War of Sauron and the Elves, Numenor capturing Sauron, Barad-dûr being built, Sauron in Numenor, Akalabeth, Last Alliance. And as a bonus, King Arthur asks, where does the show end? When will non-book characters die? And we also got a very similar question by Justine at JustineSC93, who also asked, what do you think will be the general trajectory of the narrative beyond Season 2? And among the original characters, who do you think will last till Season 5? My money's on my boy Elrond. Hee. Apologies for the hee. That was in the question. I didn't do that just for myself. So, I've talked about this before on Twitter and probably on previous podcasts, so I'm sure I've done this before, so I won't spend too long on this. Where do I think those canon storylines fall? So let's start with number 1, Forging of the Seven, the 9, and the 1. Forging of the Seven, the 9 happened this season, probably, maybe not all together, but pretty sequentially. We'll probably get the 7 forged fairly early on in the season, the 9 forged in the middle of the season. Obviously, you have to do that before the Battle of Eregion. As for the One Ring, listen, I've heard rumours that we might not see it this season. Heard rumours. Yeah. Listen, I don't know. Obviously, canonically, the 1 is forged before Sauron brings his army to Eregion, but with the time compression, there is obviously wiggle room for them to play around there. I can see the argument for why they might want to save it until next season, just because there's so much going on this season, and if Sauron is going to mainly be in Eregion as Anatar, it's quite hard to build momentum for his return to Mordor very briefly just to make the One Ring. Now, I still think they should have him make the One Ring before he goes after the others, but it does create some interesting opportunities for him to, for example, distribute the 7 and the 9 before the 1 is made, almost, walking these new bearers of the rings into a trap and only then forging the 1 and having dominion over them. So I could see how they could do that. So yeah, maybe the 1 goes to next season. As for the War of Sauron and the Elves, obviously that really does kick off with the Battle of Eregion. I think we'll definitely see it continue into Season 3. That's why I kind of thought they might keep Adar around next season, so that if Sauron's busy distributing the 9 rings to men, you could have his other lieutenants marshalling the war on other fronts. So yeah, I do think we'll see the war carry on to Season 3. We probably won't get a battle as big as the Battle of Eregion, unless they kind of adapt maybe the battle at the Gwaithlo, which they could do. Again, I'm not exactly sure how they're going to handle this part of it, because obviously within the canonical story you have the Númenóreans intervening twice in battles with Sauron in Middle-earth, and the show isn't going to do that twice because it will A, be repetitive, B, what's the point, and C, we all know where it's leading up to, which is the Númenóreans capturing Sauron. So yes, I think the War of Sauron and the Elves will continue, in the sense that I think we'll see Sauron's dominion grow, we'll see orcs ravaging the land, we may see some skirmishes between whatever Galadriel's doing, maybe she's going to head out towards the Sylvan Elves, maybe we're going to go to Lothlorien, or what will be Lothlorien, I should say. Maybe we'll see that's the way we'll see the War of Sauron and the Elves play out, but I think by the end of Season 3, we see Númenor's return to Middle-earth, we see Sauron's surrender, and we see him being returned to Numenor. I think that might even be where Season 3 leaves off, with Sauron having surrendered and having just been brought back to Numenor, and the last scene we'll see of him is probably in a cell in Numenor, but already plotting what he's got planned. Then I think Season 4 is largely going to be the Akalabeth. I think we're going to see the real, decline of Numenor. We're going to see Sauron do what he does best in Numenor, and we'll end Season 4. Might not be the last episode. They might do a kind of Game of Thrones and have the major moment in the penultimate episode. So, say Season 4, Episode 7, we'll have Pharazôn's attack on Valinor, will have the Akalabeth itself, will have the faithful being cast out on their ships towards Middle-earth, and then Episode 8, you kind of have the falling action of that. You have Sauron returning to form if not a fair form, then a body in Mordor. We'll have, Elendil arrive on the shores of Lune, meeting Gil-galad. We'll have Isildur and Anarion arriving in the south and, looking to establish the kingdoms. And this is why I said earlier that I think we would then might get a time jump between that and then season 5. I think there might be a time jump between season 4 and 5, because that way you can have the kingdoms established off screen. We don't need to see Minas Tirith, Osgiliath starting to be built, and Númenor in the north. We don't need to see Sauron spending years rebuilding his forces in Mordor. So I think to help with all that, that's why there might be a time jump. And then obviously Last Alliance in season 5. As for where the show ends, Last Alliance I think happens in the penultimate episode of the final season, or maybe the last episode, but it happens kind of as the second to last thing. Do I think we'll get the Gladden Fields? Yes, I think they should do the Gladden Fields, but I wouldn't think that will be the last scene the show ends on, just because it would be too depressing. Imagine you've watched 50 hours of TV and your reward is seeing what happens to Isildur there. So I think what we weirdly might get is we might get the Gladden Fields. We'll then see Elrond looking after Isildur's wife and heirs in Rivendell. We'll see Galadriel and Celeborn with Celebrimbor in Lothlorien. We'll see all the other characters who've survived starting to kind of try to prepare to heal and live in Middle-earth post the quote-unquote fall of Sauron. And then I wonder whether, and this is just my theory, because they've included the Harfoots, will we get a time jump, or not even a time jump, and we'll see maybe Nori or, the descendants of Nori finding the Shire for the first time, and our last shot will be hobbits walking over the hills and fields that we know will one day become the Shire. That's my best guess. Now, as for your question, your bonus question, and what Justine asked, when will non-book characters die? Let's go through them in order as quickly as I can. Kemen and Eärien in Númenor. I think Eärien is doomed in the Akalabeth, so season 4. I think Kemen may end up being a ringwraith, so I think he survives all the way through, quote-unquote survives. Not really, but yeah, I think Kemen makes it to the end. Who else have we got? Arondir. Yeah, I think Arondir makes it till season 5, but I do wonder whether he dies in the Last Alliance, because obviously we know the Woodland Elves really suffer at the Battle of the Last Alliance, and so having a character we've grown to love over 5 seasons die, that would be a great way to add emotion. Harfoots, I don't think we'll see any more of the main Harfoots die. I think they killed Sadok for that reason, to introduce the peril, but there's no way they kill Nori or Poppy. So no, I think they survive. Theo, again, like I said, I think most likely he's either being the king of the Oathbreakers or a Nazgûl, so he technically survives all the way through 5 seasons. As for other original characters, I think that's most of them. Eregion, obviously there'll be some random elves will be introduced to, so I can't really predict that. Yeah, I think... Oh, dwarves. I think Durin and Disa survive to the end of season 5, and then at the end of season 5 we probably get the reveal that the Balrog's coming. And that's how they end it in Khazad-dûm, knowing that the audience knowing that they're all about to, suffer an untimely fate with the Balrog. I think that's what they'll do. So yeah, I think Durin and Disa survive. Obviously, King Doran isn't long for this world. So yeah, that's where I think we're at with original characters. And with that, we have emptied the mailbag. We have opened all the letters from Lindon, and I want to thank you and each and every listener who sent in a question. It is most appreciated. As I said at the top of the show, it was nice to get back to doing one of these episodes in the style that the podcast originally began, and even more wonderful to get to bring in a big batch of listener questions. I think this was the perfect way to prepare for the madness that will follow later this week when we get an avalanche of new insights from Season 2, and, no doubt, a new trailer to feast our eyes on. If you're somehow new to this podcast, make sure you subscribe on whichever podcast platform you prefer, so that you never miss an episode. Also, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. It helps spread the show to new listeners and will only help broaden our community. And now that the Daily Rings of Power podcast is on YouTube, I'd greatly appreciate if you could head on over there and hit subscribe. Not to sound like a shameless YouTuber, I promise I'm not. Whilst I haven't used the platform in the past, if there's an appetite for more video-based content on YouTube, then subscribing is just a great way to let me know you'd like to see that, and something I could explore in the off-season. As always, I'd love to continue this conversation on Twitter or in the comments on YouTube, so let me know what you thought on all these great listener questions we had and what you're most looking forward to or even hoping to see at Comic-Con this year. But for today, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with what will no doubt be a big old episode on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.